This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
We think we disagree too much. I think we disagree too little. I think people who are very engaged in politics now spend all their time in cocoons where they only have to listen to people they agree with. And we spend our time talking to people we agree with about people we disagree with, rather than talking to those other people, engaged with them. And if we disagreed a little more in these constructive ways, we would be able to trust each other more. If we just talk about each other, there's no way to build trust. I think we have to talk to each other. And that is really the hard work of democratic citizenship.
The Village Square, a nervy bunch of liberals and conservatives who believe that disagreement and dialogue make for a good conversation, a good country, and a good time. At the Village Square, we talk about politics, religion, and race. You know, the topics your mom taught you never to discuss in polite company. Listen, at the Village Square, we make pigs fly.
Hey folks, welcome to Village Squarecast. This is Corey Nathan. So glad to be with you again. Thank you for joining us for American Covenant, Yuval Levin on how the Constitution could unite us again. Village Squarecast is funded in part by Florida Humanities with support from Federation of State Humanities Councils and the Mellon Foundation. Tonight's conversation closes out our UNUM series, our observance of America at 250, and what a way to close. Our guest is Dr. Yuval Levin, Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and he is a prolific author, most recently of American Covenant, How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again. What follows is a generous and genuinely hopeful look at why the Constitution was built, less to make us agree and more to help us act together when we don't. You'll hear why unity is not the same as thinking alike, why a little inefficiency turns out to be the price of legitimacy, and why disagreement done well may be the very thing we've been missing. What an idea. Settle in. There is a lot here worth chewing on. And with that, I'll turn it over to Liz Joyner, founder and president of the Village Square, and my dear friend. Liz introduces Steve Seibert, former chair of the Village Square and a Florida Supreme Court certified mediator who moderates this wonderful conversation.
Good evening. I'm Liz Joyner, founder and president of the Village Square. On behalf of the Village Square and Florida Humanities, we're delighted you've joined us tonight for American Covenant with our special guest, Dr. Yuval Levin, and the conclusion of our UNUM series, Observance of America at 250. Tonight's program is offered in partnership with Florida Humanities as part of our multi-year series of digital programs, UNUM Democracy Reignited, exploring the past, present, and future of the American idea as it exists on paper, in the hearts of our people, and as it manifests in our lives. Now I get to introduce the one and only Steve Seibert. Steve is the current chair of the Pinellas Community Foundation. He is the former executive director of Florida Humanities. And the top line in his bio is he's also the former chair of the Village Square. He served under Governor Jeb Bush as the secretary of Florida's Department of Community Affairs and served 2 terms on the Pinellas County Commission. A Florida Supreme Court certified mediator for over 30 years, Steve gained a statewide reputation for helping resolve contentious public and private sector disputes and has been named one of Florida's legal elite by Florida Trend magazine. In his long career, Steve has received appointments from 4 different Florida governors and from the Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court. Steve, welcome.
Why, thank you, Liz. It's so good to be here.
So it has been such a joy to have you with us during this whole season. We've been able to do now 3 wonderful programs with amazingly inspiring people. And I can't think of anyone more than you who I would have liked to have done them with.
Thank you. Hasn't it been amazing? I mean, we have talked to some of the most remarkable people.
It really has been amazing. And we regularly call each other afterwards and go, "Oh my gosh."
Can you believe that? Yeah, and it's going to happen again tonight.
Again tonight.
It is so exciting.
Although I do have one little bit of Village Square memory for you, and then trivia for other people is Steve, unbeknownst to me, for an in-person program that he was facilitating many years ago, showed up in a ref outfit, like literally ran onto the stage.
It was a particularly contentious night, as I remember.
And we made it through just fine. So thank you, Steve. Turning it over to you.
Why, thank you so much. Thank you, Liz. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for spending time with us tonight. Um, uh, there's so much going on. There's so many ways to spend your time, but to spend it with the Village Square and to listen to some of the great minds in America, it's just really wonderful. And I can guarantee, I promise, an extraordinary presentation tonight from Dr. Yuval Levin. And he'll show up here in a second, I do believe. Let me introduce him. It is an honor and a joy for me to introduce this gentleman. He is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He is the founder and editor of the magazine National Affairs. He is also a senior editor at the New Atlantis and a contributing editor at National Review. Dr. Levin served as a member of the White House policy staff under President George W. Bush. He has published essays and articles in numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and Commentary. He is the author of 7 books on political theory and public policy. His most recent book, American Covenant: How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again, will be the guide for most of our conversation tonight. He holds both a master's and a PhD from the University of Chicago. He is, to use the phrase from our Boston friends, wicked smart. He is civil and funny and scholarly and fair-minded and humble. Welcome, Yuval.
Thanks so much, Steve. That's awfully kind. I won't live up to it, but I really appreciate the chance to talk with you tonight.
Well, thank you so much. And we're just going to get started. There's just so much to talk about. In 2014, you wrote a really powerful book called The Great Debate. And it defined the philosophic differences between conservatives and liberals. And both of these philosophies, you noted, arise from noble ideas, but view human nature differently, and certainly the role of government differently. And you used 2 iconic figures to kind of start this conversation: the iconic liberal Thomas Paine and the British statesman and conservative Edmund Burke. Perhaps as a place to start our conversation tonight, could you better help us understand our tribes? Better help us understand kind of the fundamental differences between conservatives and liberals.
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful place to start. I think, especially given all that's happened since 2014, it's worth saying that these are, in a way, the left and right at their best, rather than the left and right as we always find them. I think that at their best, it is worth seeing that our kind of politics really needs both a left and a right, because they both bring to the table a vision of the liberal society that gets part of the truth. And the difference between them, there are a lot of ways we might describe this, but as you say, one of them does come down to a different way of understanding the character of human nature, where people on the right tend to begin from a fairly low opinion of human nature, but a high opinion of its possibilities, you might say. A Christian view, a Jewish view that says that the human person is made in a divine image, but is prone to sin, to vice, is fallen, and therefore, in order to be free, requires formation, requires institutions that can take what we are at the beginning and turn us into men and women who are capable of being citizens of a free society. And those institutions, family and religion, civil society, and political institutions are what conservatives at their best want to conserve, the institutions that are necessary for the formation of free men and women. And those institutions are always under threat. They're always countercultural, and so they always need our help. And that help is the work of conservation that defines conservatives at their best. I think people who we might call liberals or progressives begin from a different set of assumptions very often about the nature of the human person, a sense that men and women are actually born free. And to the extent that they're not free, it's because they're kept down by institutions in society that are there for other people, not for them, that oppress them in the name of the wealthy, the powerful, outside forces, and that don't exist in their service, but in the service of others. And that therefore, what we need from politics is not so much to conserve the institutions of formation, but to liberate people from oppressive forces in society. A politics of liberation rather than a politics of formation. The thing is, these are both partly true. I'm a conservative, and I'm certainly more drawn to the first of these views, and I think that ultimately, oftentimes, the biggest challenge we face is the challenge of preserving those institutions of formation. But they are both necessary, and they're both true pictures of part of what the life of a free society involves. And I think one way to think about it is that in our politics, very often the left and right tend to talk past each other. And looking at the same set of issues, people on the right will think about them in terms of order and chaos, in terms of threats to the institutions that facilitate the free society. People on the left will look at the same problems and think about them in terms of oppressor and oppressed, of who is using their strength to put down others. And so if you think about how we talk about policing, immigration, economic policy, some of the deepest differences we have, very often people on the right are talking about order and disorder, civilization and barbarism. People on the left are talking about justice and injustice, oppressor and oppressed. And again, there's truth in both of these views. Our society needs to hear them both. So wherever you find yourself, I think sometimes the hardest task in politics is to recognize that the other side, even when it's wrong, and certainly when it seems wrong, isn't entirely wrong. And so it's worth our making some room and understanding that neither side's ever going to fully win this argument. So our society, one way or another, is going to be an ongoing debate and negotiation between these different sorts of views of what freedom requires.
Oof. And these ideas have been with us forever, right? I mean, this debate, this great debate, has been going on certainly since the beginning of the country. But I think you suggest it goes back to Aristotle. I mean, we've had these kinds of conversations in Western civilization since the beginning.
I think that's right. They are enduring because they are about human nature, and human nature has always been with us. Our kind of society is distinct, and I think there are some elements of the sorts of debates we have that maybe go back only to the end of the 18th century. That period where the politics of Britain transformed from a debate about whether the king or parliament should rule to a debate about how a free society should approach the future, which is our kind of politics. That's the left right debate we know. But at the bottom of that is a set of disagreements that go back, in the West at least, to Aristotle and the beginnings of classical philosophy. But there are versions of those in other parts of the world, and they all go back as far back as we're able to look.
I just wonder if we could see see how precious these ideas are on the other side. That they they are often well-meaning, and they often have their own noble legacy as well. And that we
Yeah.
could
Yeah.
talk at the level. It would
I
be
will
helpful.
tell you, Steve, for me, one of the hardest lessons that I've learned in Washington, I've worked in Washington now for 25 years, in government and out of government, the hardest thing to grasp is that everybody pretty much means well. There are a few exceptions. There are some people who are genuinely sociopaths in our politics now and then, but very few. And most people on the other side of whatever political issue matters to you did not get out of bed this morning to make the world miserable for other people. They believe they're doing the right thing for the country. And our politics really is a debate between two sides who both believe they're doing the right thing. And oftentimes, the way to really try to understand a political issue is to think, how could a person who I think is totally wrong about this believe that this is the better way? because almost certainly they do believe that. They're not more cynically motivated than people on my own side. And it's important to try to understand that even if we're not going to agree, and on many issues we're not going to agree, the other side isn't going away. And so if the purpose of our politics is to somehow live together, we do have to try to see at least the best of what the other side might be trying to achieve. Even as we oppose them, try to resist change we don't believe in or advance change we do believe in, it's worth seeing that it's human beings all the way down and we're all Americans.
So let's go on to this is going to be a theme I think we just talked about throughout this whole conversation. But let's move to American Covenant and your recognizing these fundamental differences between people that we saw at the founding of the country. So these wise leaders got together, recognizing the differences, and then crafted a structure in the Constitution to help us govern ourselves. Lincoln's phrase, the capacity of a people to govern themselves.
Yeah.
So give us the theme, if you will, or the themes in American Covenant.
The argument begins really from the sense that one very vital purpose of the Constitution was to facilitate more cohesion in a society that was already then divided and which they understood would in some respects always be divided. The Constitution was the second attempt at American government. The American Revolution was followed by a period under which we lived under a different form of national government in the Articles of Confederation. It was more radically democratic, but less centralized, and it didn't work. It didn't work at all. The Constitution was written in the same room as the Declaration of Independence 11 years later. Those 11 years were 7 years of war and 4 years of peace. The war was fought ultimately, even if not quite at the beginning, was fought for democracy, for a Republican form of government where the people rule. The 4 years of peace were characterized by extreme instability and division, political violence, and a breakdown of social order. And the Constitution was an attempt to advance the cause of democracy and social order at the same time, even though there's a tension between those two. And it was meant to answer the very, very complicated charge that the Declaration of Independence gives for any form of government that's going to be legitimate. The Declaration says we're all created equal. We're all created equal has two kinds of implications for politics. On the one hand, it means government has to operate by consent. No one has natural authority to govern anybody else. Consent means majority rule. That's practically the only way to operate a government by consent. But at the same time, equality means we all have equal rights, including those of us who are in the minority. And so the government has to simultaneously vindicate majority rule and minority rights. That is obviously not an easy thing to do. And the American Constitution was formulated by people who understood that that was the purpose and that internal division was going to be a constant challenge. And so the book really tries to help readers see that reaching cohesion while balancing majority rule and minority rights is the complicated purpose of the American Constitution. And it's worth our seeing that because that's our challenge now, too. We're a very divided society, and we are committed to majority rule and to democracy, and we're committed to protecting the rights of all, including people who are in a political minority at a given time. And we've come to a point where we often think of the Constitution as a barrier to cohesion and unity under those conditions. But I think the Constitution is actually a tool for achieving those. And so the book tries to work through an understanding of the Constitution as intended to achieve that purpose. It starts from how the framers and the authors of the document thought about that problem, tries to work through how that thinking is embodied in the system itself, in the institutions, in federalism, in the Congress, in the presidency, in the courts, in the party system, too, which grew up around the Constitution, and ultimately to help us see what it is that unity can actually mean in a free society. And I think maybe this is the core insight to offer as a beginning for thinking about unity, because in a divided time like the one we're living in now, we talk about unity a lot. Our politicians constantly talk about unity. But what they mean by that is if people stop disagreeing with me, then everything would be great. And I'm sure we all believe that. If everybody agreed with me, I think things would be better. But that's not going to happen. And the Constitution begins from the premise that that's not going to happen and offers a different understanding of what unity can mean. James Madison, in particular, embodies this understanding. And I describe this as an understanding of unity that says, in a free society that's therefore also a diverse society, unity doesn't mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. And thinking alike and acting together are not the same thing. You can act together when you don't think alike. And if that's hard to imagine and we have to ask ourselves how, I would suggest to you the Constitution is an answer to that question. How do we act together when we don't think alike? That's what this system is here for.
And in your world, what does acting together, what does that mean? What is it?
It
How do
means
we
a society banding together to address common problems, making decisions about how to use common resources, that is, how to use the government, to address common problems, the sorts of challenges that we share as a society, threats to the security and safety of our country, challenges to achieving our desire for a more prosperous society, challenges to justice and to the equal treatment of fellow citizens, practical problems that we confront, the kinds of things we expect out of politics, we have to achieve those things even though we're not going to agree about some fundamentals. And so ultimately, our country has to negotiate its way to solutions to these problems. And our politics is shaped in order to facilitate that negotiation, to bring people who have different views into conversation and debate and competition and negotiation with each other in a way that can allow decisions to be made that don't simply involve majorities trampling over minorities, but that do allow us to make real progress on common problems.
just to state it, because I've almost never heard it. So acting together means solving problems.
That's right. Politics is there to solve problems, right? If we lived a trouble-free existence where nobody disagreed and there were no threats to our safety and happiness, we would not need politics. We have it because we have problems to solve as a society. And there's local politics because there's problems to solve as a community. There's workplace politics because there's problems to solve as a workplace. In any community of people, there has to be a way to make decisions. How do we act together when we need to act together? And ultimately, that's what politics is for.
Okay, so utilizing Madison kind of as the major proponent of how to craft a structure that allows us to do that. So what did Madison and ultimately the
Yeah.
founders craft in order to accomplish, what's your wording, how people can act together when they don't think alike?
Madison is where I start in part because he's really the one person who had this vision to begin with, and he helped to organize the convention. He was essential at every stage. He didn't win every argument, far from it. He lost a lot of important votes at the convention. But Madison had this understanding of politics to start with. He was really the only non-lawyer among the major figures in the convention. Madison was a politician. Every job he had in his entire life was either appointed or elected. And as he wrote to a friend toward the end of his life, he didn't even pretend to be a farmer, as some of his fellow Virginian politicians did, who he didn't name in that letter. He was always a politician, and he understood that what politics involved was negotiating through difference toward common action. And so for him, there were a couple of mechanisms that were necessary to allow that negotiation to happen, to allow majorities to rule while protecting the rights of minorities. The essential insight that he had was that you need competing power centers to make sure that majorities have to grow before they are given power. What stands out even today about the American constitutional system, even stands apart from other democracies around the world, parliamentary democracies, is that in our system, a narrow majority doesn't get you very much. In the parliamentary systems, if you have a majority in parliament, however small, you control all the power in the system until you lose that majority. In the American system, no one ever controls all the power in the system. There's always somebody in your way. And that someone could be the other party in Congress, could be the president, could be the courts, could be the states. There's always somebody to negotiate with. And now this is frustrating for narrow majorities, which are, after all, the only kind we've had now for 25 years or so. You win an election, you win a little tiny 3-seat majority in the House, and you think, well, I still can't do anything. I still got to talk to those people. I just beat them in the election. Every modern president and congressional majority has faced that question, and the Constitution stares them in the face and says, yep, you still got to talk to those people because they're a big part of this society. And so the system creates competing power centers. Within the legislative branch, there are two houses that have to compete with each other. They're elected in somewhat different ways. They bring somewhat different modes of action to the table. Then there's a separation of powers, and the Congress has to deal with the president, who has his own interests and his own power. The courts have a say in how all of that goes. The system is also what Madison called a compound republic. There are state governments and a national government, and they both govern. They both have real authority, and they get in each other's way all the time. And the getting in each other's way in our system is a feature, not a bug. It forces coalition building. It forces negotiation. It forces you to say, I don't agree with them, but I've got to win their vote. What do I need to do? And that's a kind of moderating of majority power that allows the system to endure. And I think it's really worth our appreciating. This system has endured a long time. The American system, the United States is the only government in the existing world today that can say that it has had the same system of government since 1800. The British have institutions that have the same names, but they're nothing like what they were in 1800. If you think about what the king did then, what Parliament did then, the United States has the same system of government that it did in 1800. We've made some adjustments through amendments here and there, but they are pretty modest. And the basic logic is the same. Our courts still open up that document from 1787 and read it to know what the law is. And that is an extraordinary achievement for a society that has been through as much change and tension and pressure as ours has. The system is very, very durable, but it endures not through stability, but through conflict and tension. Competing powers hold each other up. The system is dynamic. It's not, the separation of powers is not a structure, it's a process, right? And so it requires people to constantly be demanding their power, fighting each other, getting in each other's way. And that's why it never falls over in any direction.
But how terribly inefficient,
Yes. It is
right?
inefficient. There's a trade here between efficiency and legitimacy. And the insight that Madison had was legitimacy is a much more important goal. Illegitimacy is the biggest danger to a democratic government. If the people believe my voice doesn't matter, then it's all over. But you do pay a price. And the American government, there are a lot of ways in which our system is slow and cumbersome and messy. No piece of legislation is ever what anybody wanted exactly. But the result of that is that everybody gets a voice, everybody's involved. Now, there are advantages to more efficient systems, and there's a kind of fashion in political science now to say, look at the Northern Europeans, the Norwegians. They're much more direct democracy, it's more representative, and it's more efficient. I think, honestly, that the fact that we can even compare our government to Norway is an indication of how effective our Constitution is. The United States is not like Norway. The United States is like India. It's like Brazil. It's a mass, diverse democracy full of crazy people doing dynamic things all the time. It's raucous, it's violent, it's messy, and the fact that it is governed with enough stability so that people could compare it to Finland is an extraordinary achievement of exactly this system of government. And yeah, we do sacrifice some efficiency in order to be able to have that stability and durability.
So, I mean, I find this revolutionary what you're saying. You are saying you use a phrase cross-partisan. What is it? Cross-partisan negotiation or cross-partisan?
Yeah, cross-partisan bargaining. That's really Madison's core goal.
Okay, so cross-partisan bargaining, and in the book you use the word haggling,
Yeah,
negotiation, and dare I even say compromise. These are all features of our system as Madison and the founders intended. Is that right?
absolutely. So the idea is when you confront a problem that divides the country, the solution is not to fight it out and see who wins the whole thing. The solution is to try to bargain, to try to compromise. And there's something really to understand, and this is still very true about political bargaining now. bargaining is not meeting halfway, right? If I want to build a bridge and you don't, the solution is not to build half a bridge. Then we both lose, right? The solution is to say, well, what do you want? What could you get in return for my getting the bridge? That's how political haggling works, and it means that everybody wins something because different people prioritize different things. I think we've reached a point in American politics now when we treat that as a failure or as some kind of corruption. But that's not corruption. That's actually how we address our challenges while recognizing that different people in our society have different priorities. And it especially happens in legislative bodies. The purpose of a legislature is to allow the representatives of the different factions of our society to deal with each other, literally to make deals with each other, so that it's possible for different communities to get what matters most to them out of politics while also living together and sharing in common a sense of identity and a set of goals. And that is ultimately achieved by learning to deal with each other, by learning to bargain, learning to negotiate. That is really the essential skill, the skill of coalition building. I think it's fair to say that the loss of that knack or the degradation of it is part of the dysfunction we're living with in the 21st century, and a recovery of it, of that original constitutional skill, is really what we need most.
But that's antithetical to every practice we have today in modern politics. I agree
Well, we
with you.
might want to rethink those practices.
Wow.
Look, the Constitution, I think as a general matter, I think in this moment, the Constitution is much more the solution than the problem. It stands there and offers us a way of thinking about politics that would be a tremendously helpful set of solutions to 21st century problems. And rather than take those up, we stand to the side and treat the Constitution as if it's the problem, as if the fact that I can't get everything I want when I just won 50% plus one vote in the election is the problem. And so we got to get rid of this system. And, we want to pack the court and get rid of the filibuster and all the rest of it because it stands in the way of our getting what we want. But the Constitution is there to stand in the way of narrow majorities and say to them, grow, persuade more people before you can get what you need and what you want. I think that's a very healthy message. It's really the only way for a society as diverse as ours to govern itself, and it's something we can learn from our own political tradition.
One of our sponsors here is Florida Humanities, and the whole discussion of the humanities, which try to help people understand each other better through, uh, you know, uh, literature, history, that whole realm of humanities studies. Um, is there some value in that, in trying to reawaken the concept that our democracy would function better if we understood each other better?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that I, I I think that what we call civics education is an inseparable part of a broader kind of liberal education and humanistic education. It's ultimately an education in human nature, which we learn through history and literature, which we learn through an engagement with the greatest works of our civilization. And a lot of what you learn from that interaction has to do with the necessity for a certain kind of temperamental moderation in politics. It's not ideological moderation. The
No.
point is not just meet in the middle, as I say. The point is that ultimately people can live together and find peaceful ways to advance their interests when they have a sophisticated understanding of how communities hold together. And I think we learn that not only from our political history, not only from constitutionalism, but from the entire humanistic tradition of the West. We can learn both positive and negative lessons. As you mentioned before, a lot of times my thinking comes down to Aristotle. There's a way really that paraphrasing Aristotle is my only marketable skill. And I think at the core of what he had to offer us was the insight that virtue is a mean between two vices. Our virtues sit between two extremes. And the ways in which human beings can be at their best is by finding that middle point for themselves between the various extremes that present themselves in our lives. I think that kind of temperamental moderation is actually the best way to achieve ideological goals, and it's also the best way to secure our society and its future. And you can only learn that through humanistic education. I mean, there's no substitute for it.
I want I would like to get back uh, to s- to some of the structure and some of the history and all of this, but I want to go down this line just a minute more. And in preparing for this, you and I had one conversation, and we talked about fallibility. We
Mhm.
talked about the great quote that Madison has in Federalist Number 10. Would you share that quote, and
Yeah.
then we can talk about it a bit?
Yeah, the book begins with that quote in Federalist 10 and talking about why faction is such a problem in a free society. Madison says, as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he's at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. In other words, as long as we are free, we're going to differ because none of us is perfect. And I think that's really the way in which his political attitude is rooted in a sense of the character of the human person. There is no perfect person, and for that reason, we're all going to err in different ways. We're all going to think differently about the same set of challenges. And if we're going to be free, then we're going to differ. And I think ultimately, the idea that you can have a genuinely free society that is not somehow divided within itself about core questions is an impossible dream. In that kind of society, you wouldn't need politics. And Madison says this too. If men were angels, there would
Right.
be no need of government, he said in Federalist 51. But men are not angels. We're not going to be angels. And we do need government and we need politics precisely because we do disagree. And so politics for us is a way to contend with the fact of our fallibility, to deal with the fact that no one has all the answers. And so ultimately, we're going to have to somehow learn with each other or at least deal with each other if we're going to settle serious problems we confront as a society.
So so if we acknowledge the fallibility, does that lead us to humility and maybe even shame
Mm,
as some key characteristics for a democracy to function?
yeah. Well, you would hope so. And I think it can lead in that direction. Certainly, recognizing our own fallibility is a form of humility. And I think the system is designed the way it is in order to humble people who are not inclined on their own to recognize that fallibility and to say to them, yeah, I know you're the president, but I'm sorry, you still need a majority in the Senate to get this done. You still need to make an argument that the court finds persuasive about how the law works. And that kind of humbling of the powerful is one of the advantages of having a system of competing power centers where, a governor can say, too bad you're the president, I'm the governor. We're both sovereign. Let's figure out how this works. And that that kind of imposed humility ultimately can also lead to a more genuine humility. I think putting us in the habit of operating in ways that require us to take account of other people can also gradually teach us to more fully take account of other people. Aristotle more or less says the best way to become a good person is to pretend to be a good person. And even if you don't mean it, over time you will mean it. It will become habitual to you. It will become the way you actually think. If you make decisions that way in normal times, you will also be more reliable under stress and in a crisis because we habituate ourselves to become more virtuous. And I think that's part of what the constitutional system tries to do to create habits of civic practice that allow us to be better citizens when it really matters.
Yeah. Okay, let's kind of go back for a minute. Everyone's favorite president is Martin Van Buren. And you spent some time on Martin Van Buren.
Yeah.
Tell us how he helped move this ball kind of took the baton a bit from Madison and some of the founders, and then gave us some insights on why we have the political parties we have.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think it's probably right that no one's favorite president is Martin Van Buren. I don't even know if he was his own favorite president. But Martin Van Buren is an extremely important figure in the development of the American constitutional system because he saw the role that a party system could play in our system. I would say the biggest blind spot of the authors of the Constitution was that they believed you could have the American system function without durable political parties. They thought we wouldn't need parties. And they realized they were wrong almost immediately. Just about as soon as the system started working, the very authors of the Constitution started to form parties. Madison formed one with Jefferson. Hamilton, in response, formed one with Adams and others. And you had a two-party system almost from the start. Now, there are a few things to understand about the American party system. It's always been a two-party system because of our presidentialism. So if you look at the Constitution, the president is chosen by the Electoral College, and to be chosen, you have to win a majority, an absolute majority of the Electoral College. That means that if there are more than two serious candidates, it's very likely that no one will win a majority and no one will win the presidency. And when that happens, the House of Representatives chooses the president. That happened twice in the early 19th century, in 1800 and in 1824. And in both cases, there were very serious legitimacy crises. And the second time this happened, in 1824, Martin Van Buren was a senator from New York, and he sat there observing the House of Representatives choosing the president. The House chose the person who came in second in both the popular vote and the electoral vote, John Quincy Adams, over the person who came in first, Andrew Jackson. And there was a tremendous legitimacy crisis. And Van Buren came to recognize that what he was witnessing is actually something that should happen inside a political party and not in Congress. Van Buren understood that the system had reached a place where there needed to be two durable, substantive modes of selecting candidates before election time, and that it made sense, given the nature of the American system, for there to be two broad, durable parties. 1824 was a disaster. There were four candidates. They were all Democrats. They were all the same party, and none of them won. And the result was Van Buren's idea for a durable party system. He created a lot of the institutions of American partisanship that we've known ever since: the party convention, the local party committee, the state committee. The purpose of all these was candidate selection. The candidates would be sifted some by political professionals before the public voted, and by the time of an election, there would be a meaningful choice to make. And for president, at least, there would generally be just two candidates. The American party system is a very good fit for the American constitutional system because it creates two massive coalitional parties, so that within the party, you have to engage in the same kind of negotiation that's then required in all the institutions and between the institutions. And this was really Van Buren's genius. And, no election has gone to the House since 1824, very much because of Martin Van Buren. Obviously, the party system frustrates us sometimes. It has troubles. I think it's actually in a period of crisis now, and we could talk about that. But it's been an excellent fit for the American system, and I do think it's built on the same Madisonian logic, but applied to partisanship, and we owe that to Martin Van Buren. So don't
There you
forget.
go. So, and let's talk about this for a second. Let's kind of close this loop. So, I think you argue for intra-party negotiation, that's really, really important, and that
Yes.
we're losing that common historical approach, certainly that we've had in the past. Agreed? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the two parties are very broad coalitions. They have to be. There's just two of them, and there's 330 million people in this country. They aren't just two types of people. So within the parties, there have always been internal factions, and the negotiation among those factions is what creates the two-party coalitions. The effect of that is that the parties have a lot of internal flexibility. The Democratic Party can be something very different in Oregon than it is in Mississippi. And the Republican Party can look very different in New England than it does in the Southwest, and yet still be the same party. That kind of internal flexibility allows our politics to also have an internal diversity that then allows negotiation to happen and deals to be made by elected officials in Congress. Now, in the last 25 years or so, the system has had a lot of trouble working because we've been in a period of very unusual parity between the parties. A 50-50 period for an extended period of time is extremely unusual in the American system. Generally speaking, if you look in on American politics at any given moment, you have a majority party that is a very broad and diverse coalition trying to keep itself together, and a minority party that's trying to grow and build its own coalition. Both of those parties are engaged in coalition building, which is the essential work of American constitutionalism, for the last 25 years or so, we've had two minority parties at the same time. They've both been just about at 50%. Neither of them really counts as a majority by American historical standards. And, in every election, one of them wins by just a little tiny bit. And so we've had very small congressional majorities, very narrow presidential elections. Control of Congress has shifted back and forth a lot. There's only been one other time like this in American history. The last 20 years of the 19th century, from 1880 until 1900, looked a lot like this. 50-50, very narrow elections. Control of Congress constantly shifted. The presidency did. We had two presidents elected in that period who won the Electoral College but not the popular vote, as we've also seen. We even had a president who was elected to one term and then lost and came back for another term. As we've also seen. There's been no other example of that happening at any other point in American history. It's a function of this 50-50 period. And the question for us is, how do we break out of this rut and get back to a majority-minority politics? The irony is that politics is actually better ultimately for both the majority and the minority. There's a lot of political science on this question, that when there's a large majority in Congress, even the minority party gets more done than when we're at 50-50. And it's very hard for either party to negotiate with the other when it's 50-50, because they're always thinking, well, we're going to win next time, so we can't give those people any victories. And that means it's always about next time, and it's never about actually solving problems. I think that's the basic dysfunction of our moment. And again, I think the Constitution offers us ways forward rather than standing in our way in this period.
Mm. We're starting to get a bunch of questions. I'm looking down because I'm seeing these questions come up, but let's not go there quite yet. You've mentioned federalism a couple times in this conversation so far, and the importance of it. For all of us, would you define it? Would you define federalism for us, and then talk about why you think it is so important?
Yeah, federalism was the most significant contentious question in the Constitutional Convention. And the basic question was, were they creating a national government where the states would be basically administrative districts of the national government, like counties are in the states? Or were they creating a Congress of the states where the states would govern, they were sovereign, but there would be a kind of place to go to resolve differences between them, like the United Nations? There were strong views on both sides at the Constitutional Convention, and the peculiar decision they came to was to take those two options and say, yes, we're doing both. And they created both a strong national government and strong states. The way they did this was, the core question was, who will govern the people? Do the states govern the people, and the national government only mediates between the states, or does the national government govern the people and the states kind of serve as its administrators? And they created a system in which both the states and the national government govern the people, but in different areas. The national government is in charge when it comes to national security and diplomacy and economics, which is a small list, but economics covers a lot. And the states are in charge of essentially everything else, and all the traditional police powers remained with the states. In the wake of the Civil War, one more important role was added to the federal government's list of roles. That is the equal protection of the laws to all citizens in all states. The 14th Amendment did this. But everything else remained with the state governments. And so essentially, what you have in the American system are two parallel governments. We sometimes think about federalism as layered governments, where the federal government is at the top and the states are below. But that is not how American federalism works. It's parallel governments. They operate along two tracks and both govern the people directly. I think federalism works best when it's parallel in that way, when things are left to either the state or the federal government. Federalism gets into trouble when we intermix them, as we do now in welfare and education and healthcare, and we sort of expect them to work together. What ends up happening there is the federal government has a lot of money and dominates the system and just requires the states to administer federal programs. That means no one's quite responsible for anything. If you've ever looked at how the Medicaid system works, that's the mess I'm talking about. No one's quite responsible, and it's complicated to manage. Federalism works best when it is two parallel systems. But either way, it describes the relationships between the levels of government in our system, and the important differences between federal responsibilities and state and local ones.
So governments ought to stay in their lanes, whatever their lanes are.
Yeah, and we can argue about their lanes, and those can be changed, but I do think they need to stay apart from each other to the extent they can.
It's parallel and not hierarchical. It's parallel.
Yeah.
And it's good. That's good. Okay. Uh, you have written that it's common in American history that we fear our experiment won't last. That we've had this occur again and again. Maybe make us feel better about this, that there is
Yeah.
hope.
It's a funny thing. The most durable political sentiment in American life, it is a sense of doom. Every generation has thought the founders were amazing, but how are we going to do this? This is not working. We're just not impressive enough. We're not up to it. It's the end of the Roman Republic, right? Talk about the end of the Roman Republic starts with John Adams, and every generation has said this. Now, at some point, some generation is going to be right, and nothing lasts forever. But I do think we need to see that this sense that we're barely hanging on has actually always been part of the American story. Think about our national anthem. The American national anthem is very strange. Most nations, their national anthem is about how glorious their king is or how beautiful their country is. The American national anthem is a song about barely surviving the night. The flag was still there. That's the great achievement. And the idea that despite all the noise and all the bombs and all the rest of it, it was written in the middle of the War of 1812 and during a battle in Baltimore. And the amazing thing is we're still here. That is a deep American sentiment. And the fact that we feel it doesn't mean that we're at the end of our rope. In fact, our country has faced much, much greater crises than the one we're facing now. We have problems. I don't mean to suggest otherwise. We have very serious challenges to think about, obstacles to a successful and prosperous future that we have to work on. But are they bigger problems than Americans faced in the 1820s, let alone the 1860s? Are they bigger problems than we faced in the 1930s? Even the 1960s? I don't think they are. And what's different about this moment is not that that America is not as capable. What's different about this moment is that it's our responsibility. And that means the question of are we up to this is really about you and me. And I think our system is up to it. Our Constitution is up to it. Our political tradition can get us through it. Our economy is up to it. Our institutions are too. It's just about whether we are. And that takes not only confidence in the future, but a willingness to work together and think together. We can't have a politics where our goal is to wish away half the country. That won't work. But if we have a politics that recognizes that the people we disagree with are still going to be here tomorrow, we're going to need to work with them, and we need to get it to it, then I think we're absolutely up to the challenges we face.
Is there a canary in the coal mine that you worry about that says, "Oh, we're in trouble now. We're in real trouble now." This is a distinction between um, our time and many of these other grave challenges the nation has faced.
Yeah, it's a good question. There are certain kinds of boundaries that Americans generally don't cross. Now we've had a civil war, but that's not where we want to be again. I would worry if we see, for example, genuine defiance of the federal courts by the president or others. We haven't seen that. We talk about it all the time, and I worry about it, and we should worry about it. But that has not happened. And I do think that plain defiance of court orders, for example, would be an indication that our system is off the rails in ways that are going to be difficult to recover from. Um, I do think that genuine challenges to election integrity, which we've also seen some, but on the whole, our system is held well, would be a tremendous challenge to the potential of our society to hold together for the future. We're always inclined to say the other side's doing that now. I don't think that's happening in this moment, and I think people should not decide that the sky is falling when it isn't. There are all kinds of challenges we face now that we have seen before. We've seen very, very strong presidents in the past, and we've seen those periods followed by a recovery of congressional power, a recovery of some balance. I do believe that can happen here. We've lived now through several excessively strong executives of both parties, and I worry about that. But I don't think that's I don't think that's irrecoverable. I think we have to have our eye on those boundaries, and when the edges are being tested, we should worry. And I don't counsel against worry, but I counsel against panic. And I don't think there's a reason to panic in contemporary America.
Interesting. Okay. Let me move to some questions from our engaged audience. Do you think the Electoral College contributes to citizens feeling like their vote doesn't matter? In what way did the founders believe that the Electoral College supported self-rule?
Yeah. Um, the question of the Electoral College is really worth thinking through seriously. We have a tendency to treat the indirect nature of presidential selection in our system as just inherently disqualifying for that system. But the fact is, essentially no democracy in the world chooses its chief executive directly. Let me ask you this question. How is the Prime Minister of Britain selected? The answer is not direct democracy.
Right.
The answer is a much less direct form of selection than we have. The Prime Minister of Britain, and this is the case in most parliamentary systems, is chosen by a majority of the majority party in Parliament. So in Britain, that's about 260 people who all went to 2 universities. And they share political interest, and they don't particularly represent the whole of society all that well. The American system is much more democratic than that, not less. But it is responsive to the same concern, which is that direct election of the chief executive raises the prospect of a demagogue in a way that we should take seriously. We worry about that prospect anyway, even in our system, but it is much more of a worry in a system in which there can be direct election of a chief executive. I also, anytime you think about political reform, you have to ask compared to what? And so you say the Electoral College has problems compared to what? Compared to a direct presidential election, I think the Electoral College looks very good. In our system, in this moment, in a polarized America, if we had direct election of the president, presidential elections would focus only on the areas where each party is strongest. Democrats would campaign just in California. Republicans would focus on the Deep South because that's where their voters are. And you just need to win the popular vote. So you got to get every last voter out. The Electoral College makes sure that our presidential elections are actually decided in the middle, in the ideological middle of the country, in states that could go either way. Those are places where you have to be persuasive, where you have to talk to people as if they're not already on your team. And that's healthy and good for us. Now, it doesn't always feel that way. There's still a lot of polarization in our presidential politics, but it would be a lot worse, not a lot better, in a system with a direct election of the president. So the Electoral College doesn't work quite as it was intended. It's really never worked quite as intended. But the question, would it be preferable to replace it with a direct election of the president? If you really think about what that would look like, I think the answer is absolutely not. We are well served by the Electoral College on the whole.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier that when citizens see government as illegitimate, it's clearly dangerous. Aren't we contending with that issue now? Don't a lot of us see our government as illegitimate?
I absolutely do worry about that. A lot of us do. I think our government is legitimate. I think so even when my party is out of power. But there are reasons why people now think that our system is illegitimate. There are reasons because our system doesn't work quite as intended in the Constitution. It doesn't involve enough negotiation and bargaining. It doesn't allow enough voices to be heard. Um, the question is, in what direction does it need to change? And I think that in order to see what that should look like, we have to remember what the system is for. Think about Congress. There's very broad agreement now that Congress is dysfunctional, right? In polls, Congress's approval rating is like 9%, and you wonder who is the 9%. What are they thinking? Friends and family of members of Congress. Um, the question is, what function is Congress not performing? We all agree it's dysfunctional, but I don't think we agree about what it's not doing. Because the natural answer to that question is what Congress isn't doing is it isn't passing big legislation. It's not addressing the big problems that I worry about. And that's true. Whatever is the biggest problem you think is plaguing the country now, I guarantee you Congress is not currently addressing that problem. But I think there is a deeper dysfunction, which is that Congress is not facilitating cross-partisan bargaining and accommodation. And that's the reason why we're not passing big bills. But it matters what you think the fundamental problem is. If you think the fundamental problem is we're not passing big bills, then you want Congress to be more efficient.
Right.
You want it to work more quickly. You want to get rid of obstacles to action. You want to get rid of the filibuster. You want to put more power in leadership so they can move more quickly. Maybe you want to give the president more power to drive the agenda so that it can be more efficient. That's what we've been doing for the last 50 years, and it's been making things worse. But if instead you think the problem is there's not enough cross-partisan bargaining and accommodation, then you want Congress to be less efficient. You want more reasons for the parties to deal with each other. You love the filibuster, as I do, because it's the only reason we've had any bipartisan legislation in the last 15 years. You think there should be less power in leadership and more power in the committees where members actually engage with each other and can take on serious legislative work. That's not what we've been doing, and I think it's what we should be doing. And so it seems to me that there are modes of political reform that can help to recover the legitimacy of the system and the functionality of the system, but they have to start by recognizing that the purpose is cross-partisan bargaining and accommodation, that legitimacy matters more than efficiency, that that simple direct democracy and small majority rule is not actually the answer, it's the problem. That's not obvious, and so, I think ultimately to achieve a more legitimate, a sense of greater legitimacy about our government, we have to first begin by understanding what the problem is.
But back to an earlier discussion, you're swimming way against the current here. I mean, how do you?
Yeah. I don't have to run for office, so I can just say what I think.
But yeah, it would be an interesting campaign. That one would be saying, to their constituents, I promise I will bargain more effectively
Yeah.
for you with the opposition.
It's not so weird. I mean, that's how a lot of people used to run for Congress not so long ago, but it
Yeah.
certainly isn't happening a lot now.
I just wonder how you change the
Yeah.
dynamic, the conversation that makes this. I mean, one way of doing it is saying to everyone, and certainly this would resonate, I would think, with our friends from the right, would be, this is what Madison intended. This is clearly what the founders had in mind.
Well,
Let's go back
that
to what
appeals
they
to
had in mind.
me, but I think that ultimately the way to make this case is to start with the fact that what we're doing now is not working. And it's not working for the public, which is very dissatisfied with our national government, but it's also not working for the parties, which are not winning elections. If you step back and look at the last 25 years, neither party has really won a significant, durable victory,
No.
and has been able to sustain a majority coalition. And so the parties themselves should see that this is not working, and that by building broader coalitions, either one of them has a chance now to become a genuine, durable majority. The idea that you could win 60% of the vote in the presidential race seems impossible to people, unimaginable, but it is not unimaginable. And I think it's absolutely possible to imagine a 60% coalition. In a sense, with either party, I think it'd be a little easier for Republicans. They're the kind of natural majority party in this period, but either party could do it. They're not doing it because they're not trying to. They're mobilizing voters rather than trying to persuade people who could go either way. And the effect of that is that they are not winning. And, again, if we look at our history and you look at that one other 50-50 period, the way to break out of it was with a kind of political talent that saw that it didn't have to be that way. In that case, it was William McKinley. There have been other talented politicians like this who have seen their way to broad coalitions. And there is a type like McKinley, or think about FDR, who was a patrician of the left. Think about Ronald Reagan, who was a Republican in Hollywood for 30 years before he got into politics, or Bill Clinton, who was a liberal in Arkansas. These are people who knew what they sounded like to people who didn't already agree with them. They spent their lives being formed by the experience of trying to persuade people who thought they were wrong. And that is the essential kind of formative political experience. They were all governors. That's important.
Yeah.
And they all came from places that could have gone either way. And they managed to make those places go their way. That's a set of skills that's now very rare in American politics because people rise up through a system that consists of a series of echo chambers where you just talk to people who nod their heads in agreement all the time.
All right.
You don't really spend a lot of time in rooms where many people think you're wrong. You know, Reagan himself said that his experience of living in Hollywood as a conservative for most of his adult life was he learned that people he didn't agree with were not stupid and they were not crazy and they should not be easily dismissed. They had to be persuaded. That kind of person, and they exist in our politics, they're just rare now, is who I think we ought to look to if we're going to break out of this rut. I would look for a governor, and I would look for a governor who has some real experience persuading people who don't start out where he or she starts out. It's rare, but not impossible to find, and I think that the next phase of our politics starts with someone whose talent is formed in that kind of forge.
Interesting. And yeah, last question on this kind of line is the um some of the obstacle to trying to build these large long-term coalitions, is part of that a lack of foresight, of taking the long view of
Yeah.
how we govern, which I think is, my view would be, that's in all of our world. It's in our business. It's in all of how we work. There's a sort of lack of strategic
Yeah,
foresight.
absolutely. There's a lot of short-termism now in American political thinking. As you say, not just political. I would say that for a lot of us in politics, there's a kind of escapism that allows us to avoid thinking about the future by persuading ourselves that between now and the future, there's going to be some kind of terrible cataclysmic break, right? Maybe it's an environmental catastrophe or an economic collapse or, a debt crisis. Maybe it's a cultural collapse. Something is going to blow up. And therefore, we don't really have to think about the future. We have to think about the next 5 minutes and how do we keep it from blowing up. And the answer is vote for me and not for that guy. But
Yeah.
the reality is both better and worse than that. It's better because that calamity is not coming. There's not going to be an environmental catastrophe that means we don't have to think about the future. Our environment could be better or worse, but it's not going to be the end of the world. There's not going to be a debt crisis. We're a really, really rich country. We would be better off if we take care of our finances, but we're not going to collapse. There's not going to be a cultural collapse. Instead, the future is going to come one day at a time, like it always has. And that means it's our responsibility to plan for the future. And if we want our grandchildren to live in a more prosperous and peaceful world than we do, we're going to have to start doing something about it now. That doesn't come easily to anybody in our politics now. That kind of attitude, that kind of view is not how we think. And I think part of this is generational. Our, our class of political leaders is unusually old now, and short-termism is something that happens when you find yourself in that place. I mean, look, our president just turned 80. The previous president also turned 80 in office. The average age of the American president is 53.
Yeah.
Our presidents are really unusually old in the last couple of decades. And we've sort of seen them age in that generation. I like to point out that Bill Clinton, who became president in 1992, and George W. Bush, who became president in 2000, and Donald Trump in 2016, are exactly the same age. They were all born in the summer of 1946. And that same generation has been the generation of our leaders now for more than a generation. And there needs to be a different way of thinking about America's future. When you're 80, a little short-termism is okay. But our country is not dying of old age. Our country has a bright future ahead of it if we do our work properly. And I do think we need leaders who think that way, and frankly, citizens who think that way. Ultimately, all these problems are our problems. You can't just blame politicians. They're doing what we want, and we're voting for it.
Question from the audience. Do you pursue sustained conversation with scholars in the relevant fields who aren't exactly sanguine about the ability of our Constitution to meet the challenges of the day? And what do you think their strongest arguments are? And what is an argument that you think is persistently, excuse me, and what is an argument that is persistently made that you think is weak?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, my view is a minority view among political scientists. I would say most people in my field think that the American system doesn't make a lot of sense, and that a much more direct democracy would be more legitimate and more just. I don't agree with them because I think we probably have a different definition of legitimate and just. I think that balance that I raised before, the balance between majority rule and minority rights, argues for a mixed system. And I also think that the kind of separation of powers that we have allows for extraordinary flexibility and durability. It lets our system shift its weight without losing its balance in difficult times.
Mm.
I would say the argument that catches them off balance is that argument from longevity. Look, our system has lasted longer than any of the parliamentary democracies. You can point to all kinds of simpler European democratic systems. These countries have had 7 systems of government in the time that we've had this one. And for a lot of people, that's an argument against our system, right? They say it's old and rickety. For me, that is an argument for it. It has seen us through a lot of tremendous challenges, and it can see us through a lot more. Maybe that's just a difference of disposition. And, I'm a conservative. That makes me a minority, too, among political scientists, to put it mildly. But certainly, I wouldn't say that I'm in the majority, and I don't think the arguments of people on the other side of these questions are unreasonable or foolish. I do think they're wrong, and for all the reasons we've been talking about.
How do you see, next question, how do you see the role of money impacting the cross-partisan bargaining process?
This is a very good question, and I would say it's a question that I would answer differently now than I would have 20 years ago. I think that the peculiar shape and direction of our 21st century politics has led me to think that money is less significant than I used to think in politics. It's not at all the case now that the best funded campaign wins. It's not at all the case that people with money seem to be driving the direction of our politics. I think a lot of them are very unhappy about that direction. We are in a populist moment. And one of the things that has to teach us is that the significance of money in politics is ultimately limited and constrained. It's especially true as we've seen changes in the media environment that mean that politics is less expensive as a practical matter than it used to be. Doesn't mean we spend less on it, but it means that in order to reach people, you don't need that kind of focused advertising in a few in a few media channels. There are a lot more ways now to reach people. There are a lot more ways into the system, and broadly speaking, that fragmentation has weakened the power of money in politics. I think some of the things we've done to try to address the power of money in politics has actually made things worse. I would say that the campaign finance reforms of the 2000s, the McCain-Feingold bill, which George W. Bush supported while I worked for him, I think was a big mistake, and created all kinds of dark channels by moving money away from the parties where it was at least visible. We've empowered all kinds of dark money paths that now are much harder to track. I think ultimately what's necessary to address the challenge of money in politics is transparency, so that we can know everything. We can know who funds what and to what degree. And that's about it. I don't think constraints on speech are a good idea. And I don't think they help us address the kind of corruption people worry about.
Hmm.
I'll put it this
Okay.
way. I think I think that the kind of chain of Supreme Court cases that have pushed against campaign finance reform has basically been correct. I think Citizens United was rightly decided in an important case.
Okay. Next question, could you name a particular time or issue where this type of coalition building and compromise worked particularly well?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a lot to point to. I mean, I think basically every major piece of legislation in the 19th and 20th centuries, in one way or another, offers an example here. But I would point especially to the civil rights era, because that's actually a kind of counterintuitive example. The civil rights bills of the 1950s and 60s took a very long time to negotiate. It was very frustrating that they took so long, because while they were being negotiated, Jim Crow persisted in the South. There was tremendous injustice and violence. People were being kept from voting. People were being kept from exercising their basic rights. And yet Congress, over a very long stretch of time, negotiated a set of legislative measures that ultimately did get passed and made a tremendous difference in American life. The fact that they were negotiated in the way they were had a huge amount to do with why they have endured. Because even though Southern Democrats lost those fights and were frustrated about the results, they were heard. Their interests were taken account of. It was understood they had a part in the process. There were votes, and they didn't win the votes. And the legitimacy that lent to the civil rights revolution was tremendously important. The fact that was done not by presidential order, not by executive action, but by legislation that was negotiated in a cross-partisan way, made an enormous positive difference. Now, you can point to other smaller examples. Think about the tax reforms of the 1980s, the crime bill of the 1990s, welfare reform in 1996. The fact that these were negotiated legislative settlements rather than executive actions is why they endured. If they'd just been presidential action, the next president of the other party would have undone them. That's what we see now. Every new president comes in, spends half his time undoing the last president's executive orders, and the other half taking all kinds of actions that the next president will undo. Nothing lasts. There's no stability, no predictability. I think negotiated legislative settlements are the only way to avoid that.
Thank you. Next question. Given the difficulty of passing constitutional amendments and the relative ease for a Supreme Court majority to be formed on any issue, isn't the Supreme Court the branch of government more likely to act without the balance you described as necessary for Congress?
Yeah. Yeah, look, the Supreme Court is a very, very powerful counter-majoritarian force. It's therefore very dangerous in a democratic society. It's also essential. I mean, I do think that there's a role for judicial review, for securing government actions to the laws, that can't really be achieved in any other way. But that means that the courts bear tremendous responsibility to do their proper work, no more and no less. No more in the sense that they don't claim powers for themselves to just legislate from the bench, and no less in the sense that they cannot be afraid to enforce the rules and boundaries, regardless of who's in power. The courts are given a lot of protection and independence for that purpose. They have lifetime appointments. Their pay can't be cut. They can't be fired for making a decision that the president or Congress don't like. They have to use that power responsibly. And I would say they generally do. Not always. I'm not happy with every Supreme Court decision, but I think the courts have gotten better at this and not worse. And that by applying the law as written, by looking for a clear sense of what the law meant to the people who wrote it, they do seek to do their proper work now. And I think the judicial branch is the most effective branch. It's the one closest to doing its proper constitutional work in this moment. And I'm very grateful for it. It has stood in the way of a lot of executive excess against this president, but also the last one and the one before. And generally speaking, it has done its work properly. Obviously, we've seen periods in American history when that has not been the case, and that danger is very real. But I think we need the courts, and I'm grateful that we have a court now that, on the whole, does its work admirably. And I should say, there's a lot of division on the court, but for the most part, this court is pretty collegial. They have a lot of unanimous opinions. They have a lot of large majorities that are not 6-3. And so, the court is much less partisan than the other institutions, and ultimately, I'm grateful for it.
You're closer to it than so many of us. Do you see the uh, the cross-partisan negotiation, bargaining in the court? Do you think they're doing some of what
Well, it's
you've been
harder to
talking
see
about?
in the courts, and the court is not naturally a partisan institution, and so it doesn't happen as obviously. There certainly is some bargaining in the court. The negotiations around who writes a majority opinion and how you get people to join it sometimes can look like a kind of cross-partisan bargaining, but I think ultimately judges have to apply their understanding of what the law is, and that's a place where there's less room for haggling than we might want to see in the rest of our politics, and so I don't think we see nearly as much of it there. There are differences of opinion that are interesting, and sometimes those have to be negotiated. So there's some justices I agree with more than others, but I think they're all trying to do their job, all 9 of them.
These are really good questions.
They are.
Next one. Did the framers make mistakes you think we should try to fix? Are there amendments to the Constitution you'd recommend we consider?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that if I were to think about political reform now, I wouldn't start with constitutional amendments because they're very hard, and also because I don't think our biggest problems are problems with the Constitution, but problems with our own practice of politics. And so I would try to change the way the parties choose candidates. I'd reform the primary system. I would try to change the way Congress works. But there are certainly some elements of the Constitution that if I could just do anything I wanted, I'd love to see corrected or improved. I think, for example, that the presidential pardon power is completely unrestrained in a way that has become a problem and that we've seen used in a corrupt way now in several presidencies of both parties. Um, at the Constitutional Convention, there was a proposal made to have the presidential pardon power work like the appointment power. The president would propose pardons, and the Senate would have to approve them.
Hmm,
I think that would be a good idea today, would help that power be used in the right way, but avoid a lot of very politicized and even just openly corrupt pardons, which we frankly see now.
yeah.
That's an example. It's a relatively modest one. It's not a fundamental change to the system, but I think it could help some. Um, but look, broadly speaking, constitutional amendments represent large national consensus. They don't create it. The Constitution is hard to amend for a reason. And we've always had very long gaps between periods of several amendments coming in quick succession. Very long stretch between the 12th Amendment and the 13th, longer than we've seen now since the 27th Amendment. A very long stretch after the Civil War amendments until the Progressive Era. So the period we're living through is not that unusual in that sense. We don't have a consensus about how to change the Constitution. We don't have a consensus about really anything in contemporary America. And so I think we have to think about political reforms within the constitutional framework, think about experimenting with changes to the primaries, think about reforms of Congress before we really look to changing the Constitution.
What do you think of increasing the size of Congress so that each elected leader represents fewer people?
Yeah, I love this idea. I'm very much for it. I
Okay.
advocate for it in the book. I think that reform would be a form of constitutional maintenance, not really a dramatic change. The House of Representatives was intended to grow every 10 years. After the census, rather than just redistrict, the House was meant to expand, and it did. It expanded every 10 years until 1920.
Yeah.
And in 1920, Congress and the president decided, for reasons that no longer make any sense, that the House should stop growing. And they set the number at 435 by statute. It's not in the Constitution. And since then, redistricting after the census has meant some states lose seats and some gain. For the entire 19th century, states did not lose seats in the House. As the population shifted, the gains were distributed and no one lost seats. There was a formula used that grew the House relatively slowly, even as the country was growing. If we had kept growing the House by that formula, the House would now be larger by about 150 members. I think we should grow the House now by 150 members, and then every 10 years by that same slower formula. And yeah, one of the effects would be that members would represent fewer people, so they could be a little closer to their constituency. I think a large number of new members all at once would also mean we would advance other congressional reforms that could be very useful. It would be a moment of reform. It would also balance the Electoral College. The Electoral College delegation of each state is just the size of its congressional delegation. So a House that was more representative would mean an Electoral College that was more representative. And in general, it would be a return to the logic of the Constitution. I'm very much for it. And all it would take is a law. Congress would just have to pass it and the president would have to sign it.
Mm. What do you think generally of term limits?
I am generally not a fan of term limits. This is a place where I've changed my mind over time too. I spend a lot of time with members of Congress, and I would not say that the pattern is that the ones who have been there longest are the biggest problem for the institution. On the contrary. And more importantly, I think there are always going to be some people in Washington who stick around and who have this institutional memory, who know where the bodies are buried and how things work. Those people are going to be very powerful. And I want those people to be elected officials, not lobbyists and not bureaucrats and not staffers. That's what would happen if we had term limits, is the lobbyists would be the one who stuck around forever and knew how everything worked. I don't think that would be good for Congress. I don't think that would be good for the legitimacy of the system. So I ultimately think term limits are probably misguided. I'm glad we have them for the president. That's a different story. But I don't think we need them for Congress.
Oh, I'm exhausted. You're just brilliant.
Let me just say, Steve, these are wonderful questions, including the audience questions. It's
Audience
just
questions.
a
Thank
fantastic
you.
conversation.
It's been tremendous. The last question that I've got here, and it talks about rebuilding trust among citizens with each other,
Yeah.
and between citizens and our government. And maybe I'll put it in terms of unity. You wrote, "Forging unity is the ongoing work of American life." And in a sense, it is the forging that describes the unity. So maybe if you could answer both of those questions together, is
Yeah.
that building trust? Is the forging unity building trust?
Yeah, what I mean when I say it's the forging itself, that it's the work of acting together, and it is work. It's difficult. It's unpleasant sometimes. It involves negotiation and competition. It feels combative. It's not kumbaya, right? It's not quiet dinners where everybody nods in agreement. It's a lot of intense negotiation, and that doesn't always feel unifying. But that's the way in which we come to trust each other, when we see that we all have ultimately the good of the country and of our communities in mind, that we're trying to achieve something and that we're willing to give one another room to do it. That's the way in which citizens in a free society can really build the kind of cohesion that can hold us together. In moments of crisis, we really come together and we act as one, but most of the time, we're not going to act as one. We're going to act through a process of dealing with each other. And I think the experience of doing that is one way to build trust. I would say, I think we've lost trust in part because we misdiagnose the situation we're in. We think we disagree too much. I think we disagree too little. I think people who are very engaged in politics now spend all their time in cocoons where they only have to listen to people they agree with. And we spend our time talking to people we agree with about people we disagree with, rather than talking to those other people, engaged with them. And if we disagreed a little more in these constructive ways, we would be able to trust each other more. If we just talk about each other, there's no way to build trust. I think we have to talk to each other. And that is really the hard work of democratic citizenship.
Yuval, thank you so much for this evening. You've given us so much to think about and to work with. Your time.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, really great. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in on this, and more to be heard, I'm sure. Thank you very much. I think we are now adjourned.
Corey Nathan back with you. Well, what a gift. Just such a gift of a conversation. There was so much there. There are a few things that keep echoing. Unity, Yuval reminds us, was never meant to be everyone thinking alike. It's harder. It's the harder, better work of acting together when we don't. Our system was built to be a little slow and a little frustrating, and that turns out to be a feature, not a bug, because legitimacy matters more than speed. And maybe the line that, that lingers the most: we don't disagree too much in this country. We disagree too little. We spend our days talking about each other instead of talking to each other. Oh, baby, that'll preach. And come on, any night that hands us a solid MVB, Martin Van Buren shout out, is a night in good company. Nobody's favorite president, sure, but maybe not even his own. But the man gave us the party system, so he's earned at least a tip of the cap. Gratitude to Steve Seibert for guiding such a thoughtful hour, and of course to Dr. Levin for the hope he hands us. The future, he says, arrives one day at a time, and the work of forging unity is ours to do. With that, it's time to close out today. Please consider joining our members and supporting this programming. You can become a member for just $7 a month or $76 a year, and your business can join for $250. $250, like our country. Go to villagesquare.us/donate to join today. That's villagesquare.us/donate. While you're there, sign up for Village Square's newsletter to stay up to date with everything happening at the Village Square. Just go to villagesquare.us, and a pop-up box makes it really easy for you to do that. Or when you're on the website, just scroll to the bottom for that sign-up box. Village Square is funded in part by Florida Humanities with support from Federation of State Humanities Councils and the Mellon Foundation. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of our funders. Learn more about Florida Humanities online at floridahumanities.org. We appreciate you listening to American Covenant, Yuval Levin, on how the Constitution could unite us again. Until next time, we challenge you to reach out with an open heart and mind to someone who doesn't look or think like you. It changes everything. We'll talk to you soon, and thanks so much for listening to Village Squarecast.